Joining me today is an author, a professor, an evolutionary behavioral scientist, a man who wears a bow tie when speaking to the Canadian Parliament, and a guy with an incredible tan. Gad Saad, welcome back to the Rubin Report.
So nice to be back. Thanks, Dave.
The tan. I don't know that our cameras, I don't know that YouTube, through the wires and the tubes or whatever gets it out to the people, I don't know that it can take that level of tan.
Just you being next to me, you're going to get tan.
I hope so, because I've never felt whiter than I feel right now. That is that good Lebanese skin that you have.
That is indeed.
All right, so you've been on the show many times. You were you were on the first test show of the Rubin Report. You were on the first panel we ever did. We've done one-on-ones a couple times. From getting to know you, you have just been in sort of what I would call the fight that is happening now, the free speech fight, the fight for Enlightenment values, for liberal values, this whole thing. But I thought a nice way to start would be, you happen to be on vacation right now.
Right.
You are in the midst of a 5-week SoCal vacation. And how important is that when you are someone that puts yourself out there all the time? As I said, you just spoke to Canadian Parliament, you were at Google doing a talk. I mean, just as someone that's always out there, the shutdown, how important?
Very important, although I've done a few shows while I'm here, so there is a bit of work interspersed within the vacation. It's terribly important, not so much for going to the beach, but for disconnecting from being available to the public. Now, I always promise my wife that I will absolutely not check a single thing on social media. And then usually that lasts 3, 4, 5 days, and then I succumb to the temptation. But that, I think, is fundamentally the most important part of my vacation, which is to not weigh in every hour on Twitter, to just disconnect.
Yeah.
And so profoundly important.
How do you balance between the academic things that you care about and all the stuff that we're going to talk about for the next hour or so, and just being human? Because I feel like that's what people are having trouble dealing with. And I mean that from people that work blue-collar jobs to people that are doing high-level math stuff. I feel like people are having trouble separating like just all the noise from reality.
So I basically have, professionally speaking, I have really 2 hats that I wear. That of a professor, with all that entails, which if I only did that, it would keep me busy 18 hours a day. And then there is my public intellectual hat that I wear. Over the past few years, I feel that a large part of my time has been taken up by the latter, and now I'm trying to kind of rein that in. So to still remain a viable voice in the battle of public ideas, but I need to sort of go back to some of the fundamentals, the lab stuff. Not that I've ever given it up, but it takes time, as you know, right? To build an audience, to get people excited about what you have to say, it takes a lot of effort. And so I don't think I have the magical recipe yet, but I try to, every day, do a bit of both.
Yeah, when you made that shift, which probably was right around when I met whatever we did on Twitter, however you connect with someone on Twitter, whatever that is now, 4 years ago or so, when you made that sort of shift from academic to someone that was going to speak their mind publicly and fight with people publicly and make videos and interviews and all that stuff, did you realize how much of not just a time suck, but an important piece of your life it was going to become?
I didn't. I'm very much of a purist, so I'm just excited by things like a child, right? So I discovered that there's this thing called social media that allows me to advertise my ideas with all sorts of people, meet people that I would otherwise never meet, like Dave Rubin and countless others, even random strangers that I get to meet who send me beautiful gifts and I get to know them well, who tell me stuff that's personal in their lives. So I never thought that would be possible, but I'm amazed at the power of the medium. And I don't say this in an arrogant manner, just walking down the street, and probably you get this probably 10 times more than I do, the number of people who recognize you, who come up to you, who say they love your work, we could be on the beach and I'll be stopped. I could be in a bathroom and someone will say, "Hey, Godfather." And so that's
nothing worse than that when you're peeing and somebody, the guy next to you, it's like, come on.
But that, I look at that with a bit of humility, in that it's incredible that we have these platforms which 5, 10 years ago, a guy like me in academia could have never hoped to have. And so it's been wonderful. It's been a blessing.
Yeah. Is there a real silver lining to everything that's going on now, which is people feel like everyone's dumber and fighting all the time? And, I'm a firm believer that most of us, 80% of us, want the same simple things and to live decent lives and have some food and have some money and be able to go on vacation and have some sex and just whatever those basics are. But the silver lining, while it sounds so crazy, that obviously if people are recognizing you and rewarding you for the work you do, it shows that there's an intellectual thirst these days. It's not being given to you by the mainstream media, but it shows that it's out there.
Absolutely, and I mean shows like you that are not mainstream. I think eventually this will be the mainstream. It amazes me how the mainstream media has sort of doubled down, to use a term that we might talk about later, ostrich logic, put their head in the sand and refuse to sort of recognize some of the dynamics. Look, anything that promotes more discussion is great. I only wish that people were sometimes a bit nicer, right? I think,
but perhaps they haven't evolved to be nicer.
Maybe.
That should be your next book.
Maybe that should be the next book.
The evolution of evil online.
I mean, I think we both most of the time do this, right? We're able to brush it off, but it takes a toll. Reading about. In my case, my weight, my Judaism, it's just endless, nasty things that are written about you.
Yeah.
I wish people would recognize that both of us and many of us who play in this marketplace of ideas are really doing it with pure reasons to contribute to a discussion. And if people could learn to be a bit nicer, we would all be richer for it.
Yeah, I mean, I wish it, but I don't sense that coming down the pike. All right, so we're gonna do a lot of stuff here, but I think just first, because it couches everything else, on the free speech front, you've become one of the few people that I know of, at least on the public side in Canada, that are really fighting the free speech battle. Of course, the real high-profile guy also is Jordan Peterson, also at the academic level, of course. What is happening in Canada right now? I mean, it seems pretty scary, actually, when you hear some of this stuff.
Canada, I think, is desperately trying to become the #1 social justice warrior country in the world. It's trying to catch up to Germany and Sweden, in part because we have a prime minister who very much epitomizes those positions. And so the endless tsunami of these types of positions are difficult to keep up with. You mentioned earlier that I had appeared in front of the Canadian Senate to testify. Maybe I could mention this very briefly.
Please.
So there's a bill...
Gad, you're here to tell me what you think. You don't even have to ask me.
Bill C-16 is a bill that is now since passed. Both Jordan Peterson and I, in separate sessions, had been asked to appear to discuss some of our concerns with the bill. The bill basically refers to incorporating gender identity and gender expression within hate crime laws. That if you target someone based on their gender identity or gender expression, then it's hateful. And so then, I guess the penalty would be ratcheted up. And I appeared in front of the Canadian Senate to basically argue that the way that it was worded is so vague and potentially so dangerous that literally anything that I teach in my evolutionary psychology courses could be construed as, quote, transphobic systemic violence. And the reason why I say quotes, because those are terms that a Harvard pamphlet, the LGBTQ office at Harvard had put out a pamphlet where they argued that people who support, quote, fixed binaries and biological essentialism, fixed binaries is male-female.
It's male-female, yeah.
Biological essentialism is arguing that there are, biological realities, evolved realities, innate sex differences. If you promulgate these types of positions, you are actually engaging in, quote, transphobic systemic violence. That's not allegorical, it's not metaphorical. You literally are being transphobically violent. And so I argued that anything that I say in my course, when I walk into my course and introduce the concept of sexual selection and how sex-specific traits evolve, I only use words like male and female. I don't refer to the non-binary and non-gender and so on. So any person in the room could say, hey, in a 13-week course, you never once recognized my personhood. You're engaging in transphobic systemic violence. The answer to this very sober presentation that I gave was that one of the Canadian senators accused me of being pro-genocide.
And where did that come from?
Because apparently the fact that I was not supporting the bill, somehow through a gargantuan leap of logic, I wanted to feather and tar our transgender people. And I specifically argued that all people deserve to be treated equally under the law, but we don't have to uniquely celebrate your personhood, right? There's a distinction between treating you as an equal member of society and having to go an extra mile to uniquely celebrate your personhood. I'll give you another example. Canada wanted to now create a gender-neutral society. So the idea being that the marker, male or female, say on official government documents, should be removed, because that small percentage, less than 1%, substantially less than 1%, who consider themselves non-gendered or non-binary are going to feel marginalized by having to write male or female. So 99.9% of a population should lose an identifying marker that is part of their personhood. I am a male. I have a child that's male. I have a daughter that's female. I'm married to a woman that's female. All of these things should be removed because someone might be marginalized by that biological reality. It's insanity.
So for someone like you that deals in academia, but more importantly, that deals in the realm of science, and you have to base things on fact, this is actually a direct assault on you in a certain way, right? Like you're talking about something that's important societally, but really it's rational self-interest. You want to be able to do your job that you have been trained to do at the highest level without having outside fears. So when you finished up that talk over there, did you feel better or worse for the course of this?
I felt better in that at least my positions were on record. I didn't have any sense that the bill would be defeated. I felt very strongly that it would ultimately pass just because of the reality of the dynamics of the political system there. But at least I knew that Jordan had been heard, I had been heard, it's officially on record. So in that sense, I felt I had done my, quote, civic duty.
Yeah.
But I had no illusions that I would help sway the vote. I knew that we would ultimately lose the battle.
So when people say, I'll see online sometimes people say, oh, you guys are overestimating when someone says racist or bigot or homophobe or Islamophobe or any of this stuff. This really goes to show why these are not, we're not just making up this fight. This fight, forget what people are saying online, this fight is now starting to codify things into law.
Absolutely, right? I mean, but never mind law. I mean, people say, well, don't take these extreme examples. Well, you had Brett Weinstein on the show. I mean, is he not a real person who's experienced real death threats? So people always think that we're, in a sense, engaging in an exaggerated narrative by pointing to these extreme cases. But what is extreme today, tomorrow becomes mundane. And so this is why canaries in the coal mine stand up and sing and warn people. But unfortunately, apparently people don't want to listen.
Do you ever think that it's kind of sucky to be someone that sees something a little bit early? I think it sometimes. Like it's great at a certain level, right? Because that's what makes people care about what you're saying, because they have a twinge of, oh, that guy's onto something. But like when I sat here with Brett, and he, at the time, I don't know what he identifies as now, but at the time he was saying I'm he said a deeply committed progressive. I now know that he, at least, I don't want to speak for him, but basically has said, the progressive train has left him.
Right. Or he grew up.
Or, perhaps, I don't know that he would say it so specifically, but I knew it. As I was sitting here with him and he was saying how he was this deep progressive, I knew that it was just a matter of a month or 2 months or whatever before he'd see the thing that we've all been talking about for that long. So there's like a joy and also like a depression in that, I think.
Well, my wife often tells me that I'm an avant-garde both in my scientific career and in my public engagements. I think it's in part because I do see these trends early, but also because I have the courage to speak about them. You and I might both see them at the same time, but if I only have the courage to say it, then I appear as though I'm the avant-garde guy, whereas you saw the same pattern but were too afraid to say it.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, it's a unique combination of both seeing these patterns early enough, but then having the courage to voice my opinion. And of course, that ultimately in academia is not something, contrary to what you might think, is not something that's desired. Herd mentality is really, as we say in French, de rigueur. It's the official way to be. Don't cause too much waves. We don't want trouble here.
Right, which is so the reverse of what true pursuit of knowledge is. So when people say that, I'll also hear that, well, you guys are overblowing what's happening on college campuses, or you're overblowing that there isn't enough diversity of thought there. As someone that's on college campuses, as someone that has testified about what's happening there, and as someone that knows plenty of academics in Canada and the United States, are we overblowing this?
Absolutely not. I mean, when it comes to issues like political matters, how people make pronouncements about a given religion or not, everybody walks the exact same beat. Again, I could just use, for example, anecdotal evidence, or I could cite actual studies, but let's go with anecdotal evidence. And I think I might have mentioned this before on the show. If you just go to my personal Facebook page, you will never see anyone, and I've got hundreds of academic friends on my personal Facebook page, not a single person has ever uttered a position regarding, say, Trump that I would construe as surprising. Surprising in the sense that they might say something that is positive of him or favorable or why someone might have voted for him. Every single academic friend that I have apes the identical same position. And that's simply not possible, right? Within any group of people, you would expect some diversity of thinking. Well, apparently there isn't.
All right, so let's talk about Trump a little bit. Now, I want to be clear that right now as we tape this, I am about to go off the grid for a month. So this is going up about 12 or 13 days after we're taping this. So in the way that we live these days, Trump could have done anything by then. The impeachment proceedings could have been begun. The monarchy could have started. Who the hell knows what's going to happen? But as we tape this on, what's today, July 28th,
Right.
2017, I think you've been basically pretty fair on Trump. I don't sense that you love the guy,
No.
but I don't sense that you have a deranged hatred of the guy.
Right.
Is that a fair estimation, Gad?
That's exactly right. And usually when I've come out, quote, in support of Trump, that's not usually what I've done. Instead, I have offered very reasonable psychological reasons why someone might vote for Trump. And so you may remember this in one of my conversations, I think it was with Sam Harris, where I explained the actual decision rule that someone might use in arriving at a decision to vote for Trump. And I'll just repeat it very quickly here. So when you're choosing between two multi-attribute products, two cars, two people to hire, two mates to marry, they're each defined by many attributes. So there are many decision rules that I could use in deciding whether to choose alternative A or alternative B. One of these decision rules is called the lexicographic rule, which basically says, take your most important attribute to you and choose the alternative that scores higher on that most important attribute. That's the only thing you look at. So in the case of applying that rule to Trump, if, let's say, my most important attribute, my lexicographic rule attribute is immigration, and rightly or wrongly, I view that Trump scores better on immigration, and if I use that rule, I will choose Trump. Even though if I had looked at all of the attributes defining Trump and Clinton, I might have ended up choosing Clinton. So as someone who studies psychology of decision-making, there were very, very clear cognitive processes that we could use to explain why a very reasonable person might end up choosing Trump. Now, that doesn't mean that I, as I jokingly say on Twitter, that I have posters of Trump in my bedroom. It simply means that as someone who is dispassionate, who is studying it from my Canadian context, as a behavioral decision theorist, I could understand why people would vote for Trump. Just uttering that, the amount of hate that you get and the amount of, ostracizing that happens within academia because you dare say something that seems to support Trump, I mean, it's craziness.
How much of that do you think is sort of the elitism of academia? In other words, you're saying something that you're using the discipline that you have to give this idea of why people may have voted for Trump. So you're separating sort of the Gad human part. You're saying this is what I think is happening based on information that I have, versus other academics that because they want to go to all the parties with the academics and all of that stuff, that Trump is sort of the reverse academic. Absolutely. So the idea that they could say anything nice about the person who's the reverse, who speaks in such ridiculous speech patterns and says so many over-the-top things and tweets like a madman, that somehow that would all be thrust upon them.
Right. The way that I would frame exactly what you said is the elitists, the academics, the ivory tower folks, excuse me, they view Trump as a fatal attack on their sense of aesthetics. He is an injury to their aesthetics, right? The way he speaks, the way he enunciates, the way he shakes hands, everything about him is an affront to their haughtiness. And therefore, there is this visceral hate of him at an aesthetic level. He's grotesque, he's an ogre, he's a buffoon. And I see this position enunciated amongst some of our common friends, where I typically would consider those common friends to be very sophisticated, dispassionate thinkers, but they've succumbed to that trap, where they are simply unable to stomach the possibility that this person could be sitting in the highest office. I think it really is that simple. They despise his sense of aesthetics.
So I sense that your position on him is sort of where mine is, in that forgetting what I think about him personally. And again, I could say the phrase moral center every time I bring him up. Again, don't know what his moral center is. I'm still confused as whether he's waking up every day and making all the decisions as they come on the fly, or if there's a grand plan here, or any of that. But the part that I like is the part that the media has taken it on the chin and basically been blown apart. And that, I think, is what we needed in this country. I sense you're kind of with me on that.
Absolutely. Look, to use a cliche that I don't particularly like from sort of the buzzwords of business, he is a disruptor, right? To the extent that you wanted someone.
It's funny because they all love disruptors, but now every now and again you're going to get a disruptor you don't like, right?
And I mean, he's a disruptor in every possible way that you could conceive of that term, right? He's from outside the political class. He's never held political office. He speaks differently from them. He's a brawler. He's a real estate guy. His language pattern is that of a thug in grade 8. He is somewhat buffoonish. So in every possible way that we could think of what they aspire to, Barack Obama, he's the anti-Barack Obama. Barack Obama is sophisticated, he's majestic, he's a great orator, right? But again, those are superficial cues, right? Typically, when we look at psychology of persuasion, we look at substantive cues or cosmetic cues, right? How tall you are is something that people use when they judge your leadership qualities, but if objectively, it shouldn't matter, correct?
Right.
And so in a similar manner, the fact that he might speak in a way that is clearly much more buffoonish than, say, Barack Obama, doesn't necessarily speak to whether you appreciate his policies or not.
Yeah, and that's the part that I think is interesting, because again, as I said, we're taping this about 2 weeks before it's going to air, so who the hell knows what's going to happen. But even just in the last couple of days, there was this thing with Scaramucci,
yes,
and all the recording, and Bannon wants to suck his own cock, and blah blah blah, all this stuff, and everyone's freaking out. I'm looking at Twitter, and all the journalists, all the lefties, everyone's freaking out over the language and how can they talk like this. And all I was thinking was, yeah, I mean, I guess in some perfect world that we don't exist, I wish that government officials would be a little more professional. But the idea that Obama people and Bush before that and Clinton before that, and you can go back forever, literally go back to George Washington, the idea that they didn't speak with blue language and say nasty things about each other and all of that stuff and the infighting and backstab, the idea that this has just appeared now, it's just
full outrage, right?
Yeah, it's just fake.
It's full outrage. Again, it's trying to maintain the facade of the ivory tower, right? This highfalutin way of baloney. I mean, wasn't it Nixon who, when you look at his transcripts, every second word is F this and F that? Yeah, these guys are not Oxford professors of philosophy.
And by the way, I wouldn't want them to be. I want them to be human. That's also the irony. It's like when Bill Clinton said, "I don't inhale," it was like, you could admit you inhale. Or when Barack Obama, I guess, did say he inhaled, but it was like the idea that we have to feel guilty about all of these things. Like, we're all humans. We curse, some of us drink or smoke pot or do some other shit.
And just to mention a couple of other qualities that I think Trump does have. When you face a lot of conflicts, there's some research, I don't remember who it's by, I think it's made by Greg Murray at Texas Tech, if I'm not mistaken. He looked at what types of leaders do people wish to elect as a function of the environment. Is there, for example, war or not? And so our preference for a particular type of leadership style changes as a function of the environment, as you would expect. Well, to the extent that we now face a lot of chaos with terrorism, with the immigration problems and so on, I would have predicted that someone like Trump, a guy who appears to be a bit reckless, who appears to be as though, am I going to press the red button? Am I not going to press it? Even though he's not going, but the fact that he exudes those types of signals, I think to a lot of people that is a quality, because you have very dangerous guys in the neighborhood who might feel intimidated by someone who appears to be a risk taker, who appears to be a brawler. And so in that sense, here's another psychological reason why a lot of people might have latched onto him.
So it also goes to show why when Obama or Hillary wouldn't say radical Islamic terror or whatever phrase that you wanted to say, and Trump would just say anything, Trump was just giving them the red meat. They were going, give me something. Give me something that makes sense. Then Trump says something that's probably over the top, but they're going, well, at least it's something.
Exactly right. I should mention, I know that we both tentatively agreed not to talk much about Islam before the show, but let me just mention one or two things. I think it is a misnomer to constantly come up with qualifiers before the word Islam. And let me explain why that is. There is no Islam, there is no Islamism. Islamism is part of Islam. Islam is a set of codified ideas that has a spiritual element and it has a political element. That political element is Islamism. The manner in which now people are talking about Islamism is it's something that is outside of Islam. And I understand the reason why people want to do this. It's because they feel as though it's too gauche to frontally attack a religion. So if you attack something that has magically ISM at the end of it, Islamism, that's okay. If you attack Islam, that's not okay. But the reality is, if we're truly going to have a serious and honest conversation about this topic, we have to recognize that it's not radical Islam, it's not Islamism, it's not militant, violent extremism, and and every other permutation of a euphemism that you come up with. It's Islam. Now, most people choose to practice a cafeteria version of Islam. They pick the parts that they like, and they ignore the endless parts that they don't like, and that becomes their personal relationship with Islam. That doesn't mean...
But most people do that with most religions, right?
Most people do that with most religions, but we don't, you and I and everybody else don't stay up worrying about Seventh-day Adventists. So to the extent that Islam is now on the radar, and we have to talk about it honestly, we have to stop trying to give a free pass to Islam, but the real problem is something else, some variant of it. Okay? Islam is codified in the Quran, it's codified in the Hadith, it's codified in the Sirah, the biography of Muhammad. That's it. Now, is there a way that I could read those texts and come up with a message of brotherly love and love for Jews? No. That's not Islamism. That's not radical Islam. That's Islam. Now, as I say this, I also recognize that 95% of all Muslims are just as nice as anybody that you could hope to have. That's not because they practice a gentle version of Islam codified in some other set of texts. That's because they're decent human beings who decide to, like the rest of us, pick and choose which parts apply to their daily lives and not. So we have to be very careful and honest about, and I hope that at some point soon, a greater number of our common friends will actually heed what I'm saying now.
Yeah. By the way, for the record, because you just mentioned that we said we weren't going to talk about that much about Islam, it's not because we're afraid. I think we both we both talked about it plenty of times, but we realized that we wanted to get more into some science stuff and plenty of other stuff. So I just want to be clear, because otherwise people go, why didn't they? You see, they're afraid now. All right. So very quickly on that though. So you are writing a new book right now, which deals with this and deals with Ostrich Parasitic Syndrome.
Yes.
So very quickly, for those that don't know what OPS is, let's talk about that, and then I want to talk about the book, and then we'll move to science.
Sure. Thanks for asking. So let me sort of step back and give some analogies. So if you look in the animal kingdom, there are many cases where you have brain worms or pathogens that enter the brain of a particular species, and it renders that species zombified. Okay, so example, a mouse can be infected by a particular pathogen. It loses its innate fear of cats. That's not a good thing if you're a mouse, right? There's another type of brain worm that attacks the brains of ungulates, let's say moose or elk or deer, and they become completely zombified, where they just circle in the same spot until these looming predators come and eat them, right? Think of another example. Someone who suffers from anorexia nervosa, right? Their thinking now has become so disordered that even though they only weigh 70 pounds, they look at themselves in the mirror and they genuinely think that they remain grotesquely obese and they need to lose a bit more weight, right? So there are all sorts of ways, there are all sorts of analogies where, whether it be in the human context or with other species, where our brain become hijacked by either disordered thinking or literally a pathogen. So I took these ideas and I argued, well, what could explain the collective psychosis, the collective departure from reason that we see being exhibited in the West? Not only as relating to Islam, but as relating, for example, to the negation of the idea that humans are biological beings, that there are sex differences, that there are male. So this ostrich parasitic syndrome is not only applicable to Islam. And so that's how I came up with that term, to use the metaphor of the ostrich that buries its head, even though it doesn't truly do that, but it's an apt metaphor of denial of reality. Parasitic in that it genuinely parasitizes your brain and you lose your ability to think. Now, I specifically apply it to Islam because typically the ostriches that succumb to OPS engage in all sorts of cognitive distortions to protect Islam, right?
Which ironically, you're talking about people that are not Muslim for the most part, right?
Absolutely. So many of the OPS sufferers will end up being non-Muslims who, because they've been parasitized by OPS, will come up with all sorts of disordered thinking to defend Islam, right? And I give many of such examples. Now, I take this idea, and it's part of my book. So the book is tentatively titled Death of the West by 1,000 Cuts. This is the idea that we are currently facing this OPS epidemic because of a perfect confluence of faux intellectual movements that have parasitized our brains. So it's not one thing. It's radical feminism, it's identity politics, it's cultural and moral relativism, it's postmodernism, each of which uses its own machinery to parasitize our brain to move away from reason, right? I reject the idea that there's male and female. Well, evolutionary biologists and evolutionary psychologists don't, right?
Yeah.
I reject that there are innate sex differences. Well, the average 3-year-old knows that there is such a thing. I reject that there is any link between Islam and any terrorism. Islam is peace, right? So how did we lead to this? Well, we were led to this by 40, 50 years of these movements chipping away at our commitment to reason, and hence Death of the West by 1,000 Cuts.
So what was the failure of the side of reason then for the last 40 or 50 years? What did the people that were reasonable, that were sensible and trying to deal with things honestly and see the world as it is, not how they wanted it to be, where did they fail?
Well, so if I speak in the academic ecosystem, I think the fact that we tolerated these affront to human decency and human reason, like postmodernism, to exist. It really came from a place of, we have to tolerate, in this case, the intolerable. The intolerable in that nothing could be further from being anti-scientific than postmodernism. What does postmodernism say? There are no objective truths, other than, of course, the one truth that there are no objectives in, right?
Right.
So they miss
other than the thing you really got to believe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So postmodernism and all of its endless faux profundity and faux nonsense is really a direct attack on science, right? Science presumes that there are certain universal regularities that we're going to use the scientific method to try to better understand. Well, imagine if now a bunch of nihilists come along who say there is no such thing as truth, there is no such thing as objective truth. Well, that chips away at the reason why we all exist in science, to try to understand the world.
But how would academia fight that properly? If the idea is we have to battle, I know we both believe in the battle of ideas. So if the idea here is that in colleges you're supposed to have these battles, I know you beat it with better ideas, but how would that have actually happened?
Well, I think what probably ended up happening, I mean, I'm surmising here. I'm not sure how it happened, but I'm guessing that most people are busy in their daily lives, right? For the same reasons why most people don't speak out against Islam. Let Dave Rubin worry about that. Let someone else worry about that.
He's thrilled.
Right. I'm busy preparing for my daughter's graduation. I got to pick up the tomatoes for my groceries today, right? And so people diffuse responsibility to others. So in a sense, there's a split within academia from the sciences, the natural and social sciences, by the way. It is wrong to presume that the social sciences are any less committed to the scientific method than the natural sciences, which is something that we could talk about.
Yeah, I do want to get to that, absolutely.
People are busy, right? So the chemist sits in his lab and he sees that there's a bunch of humanities guys utter gibberish.
Right.
Well, he doesn't necessarily have the time and energy and proclivity to weigh in on it. And so somehow these guys found a little niche within the ecosystem called academia, and they flourished and they multiplied, and the cancer spread and metastasized. And now 40, 50 years later, you have generations of students who've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars being trained to be naturally lobotomized morons.
Yeah, it's so, the metaphor is perfect of this parasite that gets in there and keeps multiplying. And I can picture now the biology professor going, all right, I kind of see that, but it's not going to affect me here, except now what we're seeing is it's starting to even creep into that. Have you seen this? There's this great picture online of, somebody selling the shirt and it says, there are no genders, but you can only buy it in male or female,
yes.
and it's like, there you go.